a second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education. All of these rights spell security.
8 out of 10 students said that they wanted free health care, they wanted the government to pay for their tuition, they wanted the government to pay for the down payment on their house, they expected the government to, quote, give them a job. Many of them said that they wanted the government to tax wealthier individuals so that they would have an opportunity to have a better life.
Seen it before. Now, to give us some more insight on entitlements, welfare, and entitlement challenges that we're facing, we are pleased to have Professor Jack Chambless with us. Professor Chambless is a professor of economics at Valencia Community College. He's a noted international speaker on the economics of liberty. He's appeared as an expert commentator on Fox News, CNBC, Neil Cavuto, Neil Bortz, the BBC, and National Public Radio. He has yet to appear on Talking with Tico, but we'll talk about that later on. His works have been published in the Wall Street Journal, the USA Today, U.S. News and World Reports, and the Atlanta Journal, as well as many other foreign and domestic publications. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Jack Chambless.
Last fall, I went into my first day of classes into 3 live classes that I teach with about 180 students total. And I had them write an essay on what the American dream means to them and specifically what they believed the federal government should do to help them achieve their dream. The first part of their answers were pretty standard stuff. They wanted a home, they wanted to be able to take vacations, they wanted to be able to afford children and have health care and what have you. But 8 in 10 of them, and these are students in economics classes, most of whom are business majors, roughly 8 in 10 of them wrote some of the highlights you saw there, that they expected the government to give me health care, pay for the down payment on my home, tax the wealthy, and on and on and on. By the way, I should mention that they had one multiple choice question in the first day as well. The multiple choice question asked them to select the principal author of the United States Constitution. 1/3 of them selected Karl Marx as the author of the United States Constitution. Last year, Valencia College won the award for the best community college in the United States of America. Last Saturday, I was in New York speaking at the Foundation for Economic Education. I assure you, wherever I go, I don't think the Karl Marx answer would be much different at Harvard. I don't think it would be much different if you interviewed registered voters. This country is economically and in terms of liberty, very, very ignorant, and we're here today to help try to shed some light on what to do about that. Part of your obligation, I believe, to help educate the American people is to help them understand how we got to a place where today over 44% of the American people are receiving taxpayer assistance on a monthly basis. 44%. It was 29% in 1983. We have now crossed the crucial tipping point where over 50% of the American people no longer pay income taxes. We have to ask this very serious question. What happens to our country once we get to the point where more than 50% are living off of their fellow man and more than 50% are no longer paying income taxes? How would someone like Mr. Lemieux run a campaign advocating getting rid of the income tax or reforming income tax or reforming entitlements once we get to the point where more than half the country is living off of entitlements and more than half the country is no longer contributing to the economy around us? We are perilously close to the same place that helped destroy the Roman Empire. In 1787, when the Founding Fathers met in Philadelphia to craft our Constitution, all of them except one during the convention agreed that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution should read, "The Congress shall have the authority to lay and collect taxes, impose duties and excises, to pay the debts, provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States." They were all very concerned about the ambiguity of the phrase general welfare, so in clauses 2 through 18, they specifically enumerated and identified what future governments could do in the name of the general welfare, with the exception of one person. And this is one person you need to make your fellow Americans aware of, because he became and still is today the enemy of everything that we believe in. Alexander Hamilton stood on the floor of the convention and gave a 5-hour speech. During this speech, he advocated effectively for the elimination of states' rights. Mr. Hamilton advocated a chief executive elected for life. Alexander Hamilton once told George Washington that he had long ceased giving any weight to the opinion of the common man. And Alexander Hamilton, during the convention, argued that we should employ a liberal construction of what the phrase general welfare meant. He argued that we should not have the enumerated clauses and that the federal government should be able to spend money on whatever it wanted to spend money on, so long as that it could argue that it was for the general welfare. Hamilton believed in the philosophy of Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau argued that among the common man there existed something called the general will. And that even if the common man can't identify or articulate what the general will is, the ruling elite have the ability to identify for the common man what the general will is. And Hamilton believed this. In hundreds of places in speeches that he wrote, he referred to the general will, the public good, the general welfare, the common welfare. He did believe that elites could identify accurately for the common man what the government should do for us, and therefore the Constitution should not have these enumerated clauses because it would confine the government to the legislative fields in the Constitution and limit the government's ability in the future to do things for the general will. If you read some of the quotes on the other founders, James Madison warned that the government was a limited one and must adhere to the enumerated clauses. Otherwise, the Constitution would go through a metamorphosis into a character which there's a host of proofs were not contemplated by the Creator. Jefferson and others repeatedly warned what would happen if we allowed future governments to stray from the enumerated clauses. Very cleverly, I should mention to you, by the way, not one founding father seconded anything that Alexander Hamilton proposed at the convention. According to Senator John Taylor of the time, Hamilton left, quote, in despair, went back to New York to rarely return to the convention. Hamilton very cleverly supported the ratification of the Constitution in the Federalist Papers, and then as soon as the ink was dry on what Hamilton called a frail and worthless parchment, as soon as the ink was dry, Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, embarked on a campaign to gut the very Constitution that the founders had agreed on. In 1794, there were refugees fleeing San Domingo for protection in Philadelphia and Baltimore. Congress appropriated $15,000 for their relief. James Madison stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and said, quote, I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article of the Constitution which granted a right to Congress of expending on objects of benevolence the money of their constituents. And here we are today, where 62% of all the taxes you pay are a transfer of your private property to another citizen, just as Hamilton had hoped for and envisioned. This happened as a result of a 1936 Supreme Court case, Butler versus the United States of America. Many of you know that we had survived the first and second Bank of the United States of America, only to see those go away. You know that in 1913, with the 17th Amendment that eliminated the election of national senators by the state legislatures, the 16th Amendment that created the income tax, modeled perfectly on Alexander Hamilton's national property tax that led to the Fry's Rebellion, and the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank, Hamilton's vision for America and a living document was winning. And it was cemented in 1936 when Congress passed New Deal legislation called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which imposed a tax on the first processor of all agricultural products. And the tax revenue was to go to farmers on the condition they would set aside their land and not grow food on their land. Amazing, during a time when our country was going through starvation, Franklin Roosevelt's genius economic strategy was to see to an increase in food prices. So, the Agricultural Adjustment Act gets passed, but a fellow by the name of Butler, a cotton processor, sued the United States government and the Roosevelt administration. And his lawsuit went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1936, under the threat of the Supreme Court being packed with more justices, you may recall this, under that threat, the Supreme Court ruled that, look deep in the language of the Butler case, the Supreme Court ruled that Alexander Hamilton was the authority on what the General Welfare Clause meant. They specifically said Hamilton was correct. The guy that nobody agreed with in 1787. The man who created the idea of a living document, who has given us the groundwork to create Obamacare, to give us, I beg your pardon, both Republican and Democratic socialism and increased spending. Another thing that people need to be aware of. Both parties have been up to their eyes in taking from one and giving to another. Once the Supreme Court sided with Hamilton and said that the enumerated clauses did not guide government spending, from that day forward, government spending, especially on entitlements, has exploded, and we find ourselves where we are today. The challenge is to educate your fellow man on the General Welfare Clause. You need to understand something. Every dollar that you go into a voting booth to take from your fellow man to give you your dream is a dollar that you are reducing the American dream of someone else. Theft is theft. I would encourage all of you to do everything you can to help your fellow man understand that the voting booth was not meant for us to take from one another. It was meant for one another to treat each other with respect, value our liberties, and otherwise leave us alone to guide our own lives. Thank you very much.